Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the third in the Ed Talk series from Imagine Education. And today we're going to hear from Hamish Higginson, who's the Director of Programs for Imagine Education, who's going to be talking to us about sustainable professional development. Don't follow the Satnav. Can you just put on the second slide there for me, Hamish? Just to reminder that if you mute yourself when you're when the webinar starts now, and if you have any questions, if you type them in the chat section, then we'll discuss them at the end so we don't interrupt Hamish as he goes through. So Hamish, over to you. Looking forward to it.
Well, listen, thank you very much for coming along and listening, and those of you who are listening to this on record. Listen, now, just to get us started, something which maybe we don't do enough of today in education is asking why. For without asking this, we are likely to maintain aspects of education that are no longer beneficial or appropriate, and eventually to the detriment of all those involved. Now, globally, there's an increasingly frequent conversation, which I'm sure you're all aware of, about the direction education is going and the need for certain systems to change, student outcomes to reflect modern society, and that humans will never be able to really compete with computers. So why place so much emphasis on assessing knowledge and retention? No matter what your opinion might be here, what we do have to recognise, though, is that it's the teachers who will be at the heart of this, and it's their sustainable professional development that will enable education to move at the pace that it needs to, respond organically to the environment it's in, and really to place value on the changing skill sets and competencies, no matter how many policies or non-negotiable classroom practices or fancy bits of tech or multi-academy trust directives there are. It's always really going to be the teachers who are the kingmakers of a student's experience in their school and their outcomes. So who's the educational Satnav program for? At times, we all must have felt that our education system is either too formulaic to be truly representative of teacher professional development or students' needs. How many of us have sat in the staff room meeting or whole school CPD questioning whether a templated set of classroom instructions is either really appropriate for your classroom or even reflects the needs of your students? Really, we should be asking ourselves why the most important ingredient to education appears to be neglected in most instances of CPD: pedagogy, the behaviours associated with being a great teacher. Basically, that forgotten art of teaching. Ultimately, if we're not empowering our teachers through CPD to engage with, develop, and to use their full toolbox of pedagogical behaviours, then we're not only limiting them in their scope, but we're also reducing the learning experience of the students. Essentially, we need teachers to be learning facilitators, not computers or robots. So how to change the Satnav? Well, maybe the question is, how do we reprogram the Satnav? With the increasing growth of academy chains, educational trusts, large educational service providers, there's an ongoing risk that the diversity of skills and behaviours required to respond to different educational environments is diluted, or worse, becomes lost in that drive to prescribe rigid pedagogies that often fail to acknowledge that each classroom has its own personality. In the same way that students have their own personalities grouped into a classroom of 30, that classroom has its own needs, its own desires. And ultimately, if we keep going down that path, teachers risk becoming the passive, programmable recipients of their own professional development. So how can we go about it? Well, firstly, I think we need to consider the personal, making efforts to take a personalised approach rather than relying on a top-down bureaucracy. Base it on affirmation rather than gap analysis, and take a coaching approach rather than a prescriptive one. We also need to consider the environmental, looking at the supportive structures that already exist in schools and how we're able to mobilise them to enhance professional learning and the safe, reflective environment. We also need to consider strategic, employing pedagogical frameworks which promote and value behaviours, habits, attitudes, those things of a great teacher, and then aligning those to the school improvement and performance managements that are in place. Lastly, we need to consider how to value, measure and reward by promoting a reflective and progressive approach to development that encourages, rewards, values innovative practice and the taking of risks. Essentially, we need to invest in our teachers, their pedagogical behaviours. We need to value and recognise those behaviours which stimulate competency development and not just knowledge recall. We need to enable the capture of that naturally occurring evidence that teachers generate each day and every day. Teachers are, essentially, by their very nature, the agents of change and should not be limited to becoming passive actors of a bureaucratic process. Now, at Imagine, it's always been about promoting the whole, whether this has been about developing teacher pedagogies or student competencies. So the question is, what makes up the whole? Firstly, there's the human capital, the knowledge-based certification which requires us to loosely understand and regurgitate on demand, which, if we look at most educational systems, is sadly 100% of the focus. And then there's the community elements, which are referred to as the habits, the attitudes, and the behaviours. Essentially, what makes us, us. Now, the idea here isn't to place one above the other, but to recognise and value each equally, not to concentrate on one at the detriment of the other. Education needs people who can adapt, to see connections, to innovate, to communicate, and to work with others. These are all attributes that need to be invested in. Opportunities to develop behaviours, attitudes, habits, and competencies aren't new. Essentially, as we navigate each day, we are naturally developing and illustrating many of these community elements and professional behaviours. However, something seems to be holding us back. Maybe it's the lack of pedagogical literacy or narrative. Are we talking about this enough? Are people accountable for their behavioural change in enough detail? Or potentially, is there too much attention on consistency and non-negotiables and not enough on the virtues? Either way, by concentrating too hard on a predetermined set of actions, we lose focus on what it means to be a teacher, and therefore the importance of human interactions and trusting relationships. Now, by investing in the means to promote and capture these community elements, we also enable the recognition which should be placed on them. Essentially, what is measured is managed. Now, all this hypothesizing is all well and good, but how often have we been on a course and failed to implement what we've learned? In teaching, this is a constant threat. As when a teacher returns to school, school happens. All those great initiatives, all those great ideas that we've taken from a fantastic workshop, all those documents that we bring back with the intentions to then put into place, slowly gather dust on the side of the desk. We've all been there. A teacher's role in school is non-stop. But how do we therefore overcome that? And how do we create that environment where affirmation, where agency, autonomy, and value are part of that professional development cycle? How is it that we're able to promote teachers to be able to put things in place so that they're able to continuously drive their professional development, put things into action, share ideas and reflect? Well, Imagine Education's model for sustainable professional development in schools works to develop supportive communities of practice, where teachers work together, support one another, share ideas, and build the autonomy and agency which is so important within a professional career. Teachers are, in essence, they're professionals. They understand their classroom, they know their students, they're aware of the challenges that students face before 8 o'clock in the morning and then go back to post 3:30. It's about building personalised behavioural frameworks where we move away from the top-down bureaucratic one-size-fits-all method and concentrate on ensuring that development is relevant, contextual and appropriate. As we said before, each teacher is an individual. In the same way that their classroom requires different methods and means, each teacher has their own behavioural changes that they need to take or focuses in developmental areas, in the same way that they have their own strengths. We also need to create space both physical and metaphorical, for individuals and groups to reflect, so that teachers have the time and space to recognise that CPD is a continuous journey rather than a periodic event. And also by providing tools for capturing behavioural change, moving away from that one-off gap analysis systems that currently fulfil the appraisal systems in most schools. So what happens when you begin to focus on behavioural change, and what does it achieve? Well, it measurably increases the impact of CPD by ensuring that the outcomes of professional development are put into action and that they're valued. It builds agency by facilitating an environment which drives collaboration, feedback, reflection, and trust. And it raises motivation by reducing the workload associated with appraisals and staff development, whilst enhancing the contextual relevance of all that hard work. In essence, it allows teachers to be able to value and affirm their strengths, whilst also recognizing their areas of development. By aligning that alongside school development plans, they're enhancing the ability of the school to be able to also increase its effectiveness. But it also moves the focus from a predetermined set of agendas that a large school or establishment might have, to be able to be more reflective and more responsive and more fluid to the needs and requirements of the teacher. Now, in conclusion, in our efforts to reprogram the Satnav, we need to focus on the personal rather than the prescriptive. We need to engineer an environment that supports and values autonomous professional networks. We need to encourage and reward innovative practice and risk-taking. We need to develop agency through the sharing and promoting of new ideas within the school. And probably most importantly, we need to align school improvement and performance management to pedagogical behaviours. Essentially, we need to focus on the teacher as a professional and as an individual, rather than a tool, a robot, or a computer. And then they will show you how it's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Some really good food for thought there. That's excellent thinking about the way in which we should approach the CPD and how we should be supporting teachers on that journey to help them become better educators. I'm just looking through some of the notes now and the comments on the chat, and I've got a few questions that have come through. So let's just have a look at this first one. Okay, so you mentioned about the forgotten art of teaching. So does that mean you're saying teaching is creative and it's not so much that something can be taught, or is it? And also, it's the second question, really, all tied into the same thing, really. So preparing teachers and developing them professionally, is it more about their skills or the behaviours?
I think the thing about teaching is that it's responsive. It's responsive to the needs of the students. In essence, it's a difference between it's relatable to assessment in that sense, and it's the difference between summative assessment and formative assessment. Teachers should be able to respond to the need of their students. And if they're able to do that, then they will find that they're able to relate to, understand, build upon learning, and challenge students through a structured way, rather than rely on a predetermined set of pedagogical actions or structures that are placed within a classroom or within the learning, which essentially requires a student to conform to a particular pattern. And it's these professional behaviours that we should be encouraging teachers to reflect upon, share ideas about, come together. For example, the year 6 teacher talking to the year 2 teacher, or the English teacher talking to the science teacher in a supportive community of practice, sharing their ideas, sharing their understanding about what works within different circumstances. And it's this that we talk about when we consider the toolbox, the complete toolbox of a teacher's pedagogical skill and understanding and behaviours. so that within any given situation, a teacher is able to pull upon either learning strategies, but it's also the communication, the interconnectedness of a student and the teacher, and the way in which the students might be learning, they might be thinking, and how the teacher is able to respond to that. And I think it's that is the essence that makes a fantastic teacher. We can all think back about when we were at school ourselves, and maybe we had two different maths teachers. Their understanding of maths was probably the same. You know, they both had a high level of understanding in maths. They had their GCSEs, A levels, potentially even a degree in their subject. However, one teacher was able to engage us. One teacher was able to make us think, to love the subject. And that is the essence in itself that we want teachers to be able to consider, to reflect upon, to build and to drive, rather than CPD resting upon a teacher's understanding of a predetermined set of actions that happens through the classroom. We should be encouraging our teachers to take risks. We should be encouraging our teachers to respect themselves and their professionalism, as much as we should be encouraging our students to be taking risks themselves and to challenge themselves.
Okay, thank you, Hamish. That's a really comprehensive answer to that one. So I think Jim's had a question from somebody else. So if you want to put that question, Jim.
Thanks, Hamish, for that. And sorry I didn't put it on chat, but I can't find the button. I think this person summarising what you're saying is that behavioural change in teachers, together with communities of practice, are like at the core of your message. So can you confirm that? And secondly, you also said the systems that have those things in place are more reflective and responsive to the needs of the individual teacher. But here's the rub. In your experience, you know, we always talk about a myriad of learning styles and teaching styles. Are there some gaps which you've spotted as being really key gaps in that behavioural change and successful communities of practice that would actually make a difference?
Yeah, certainly. And that's the first question. Yes, Jim, that's what I'm talking about. It is key to focus on behavioural change and the implementation of communities of practice. I think communities of practice can come in all different guises, and different schools and different environments will have their own way in which they wish to implement them. I've seen successful communities of practice that have been subject-based or year-based in a large secondary school where they've had multiple smaller communities of practice, and in smaller primary schools where they've just had one community practice which is spread across the whole school. So it's really dependent on the school itself, the setup, its needs. But I've also seen communities of practice which have been geographical as well. So it's about bringing together different schools to support one another. And it's here where we really have a sense of empowerment. And this is one of the key things about those communities of practice, is that it really needs to be something, and in terms of behavioural change, it really needs to be something that is felt to be bottom up, that this is about teachers and their professional development, rather than something that is being placed upon them. And in my experience from conducting this type of work in many different countries around the world, teachers often feel done unto. And so with that, also less eager to engage in certain professional development activities. However, when we place the onus and the agency with the teacher to be able to first to record their growth. So we're talking about self-affirmation. And then when we mix that together by recognizing the professionalism within teachers and saying, okay, so it's not just the self-affirmation, it's also about the peer affirmation of whether or not I have done something different or I'm challenging myself to change my professional behavior. We start to take the ownership of development away from one individual person, be that a line manager or a senior leader, and we start to build that agency amongst teachers and a recognition of their professionalism. Now, one of the part of your question, Jim, was about what are the things that sometimes appear to be lacking, or some of the challenges within this? And a key element to this is that school leadership, or whoever might be, it might be a subject leader, it may well be middle leadership or senior leadership, have to have buy-in with this. We're looking at it as a school being a community rather than a group of individuals. And so that also requires the senior leadership team to also be considering their own professional behaviours and their behavioural change systems as well. Now, we all have our own framework in a sense. There may well be a library of behavioural behaviours. However, we're all on our own journey in that sense. And if we're able to view this as a collective approach whilst also being the individual, then we're able to support one another. We're able to offer time, meaningful time for teachers or senior leaders to consider and to reflect. And this is why I spoke about there being physical space and also a metaphorical space for people to sit back, to be able to reflect either as an individual or as a group on their behavioural change. And that is when we start moving away from viewing professional development as a periodic event that we just attend every now and then after school or whenever it might be, into something that is an ongoing process. And as soon as we start to feel and witness and see this as an ongoing process, then we start to really get a sense of development from it. And it's human nature to notice that when I'm growing, when I'm developing, I get excited about something and I end up putting more effort in. And this is where I come back to my first point about it being bottom up. And that sense of ownership, that sense of autonomy, that sense of agency, which in places is missing from teaching. However, teachers are passionate individuals. They went into this career because they wanted to be teachers. They didn't want to be robots, and they didn't want to be programmed to deliver non-negotiables. They are the people who understand their classroom. They are skilled, they are professionals, they know their students. And so we should be offering them and supporting them to be doing that.
Hamish, this week we've been helping with the British Council selecting some applicants for the Baldev Singh Teacher Award. And these are teachers from all around the world. And I was on a panel looking at teachers from Pakistan and Kenya, for example. So this is a rider question from me, building on the last one. Teachers all around the world have got different sets of problems. And you've worked all around the world, from Africa to the Far East and so on. Do the pressures on teachers vary according to the system they're in, or is there some sort of common approach which applies no matter where you are?
I think if you take it down to the minutiae, there are always going to be different pressures on individuals, and that comes from just being a human in a certain sense. Whereas we're human, we take ourselves into the classroom in the morning. You can't just leave it all at the front door in that sense, and when we come home we take it with us. However, if you look at it on a more general basis, I think education has its challenges globally in that sense, and we are stuck in a way in an industrialized view of what education should be. However, what is really pleasing is that you look globally at this moment in time, and there is a real drive to change the outputs of education and to look at those community elements that make up the individual and how education is able to respond to that. And one of those kind of great challenges within that is that education is fairly centralized, in the sense that the directives come from above and get placed down onto regions and then onto groups of schools and then onto the school and then through down onto translated onto the teacher. And so all teachers feel those pressures in that sense. And I believe we're really at a turning point in terms of what education can be and what it will be in the future in terms of measuring who students are and supporting students to become what they can possibly be. And if we're bold, if we're strong, and we're able to be brave and move away from a very kind of strong knowledge acquisition and retention, regurgitation kind of framework of what education is, and start looking at the whole individual, their attitudes, their behaviors, their habits, and ways in which we're able to record these and illustrate an individual, illustrate a student as well as a teacher in that sense, of who they really are past that certification. So yes, in your question, yes, there are struggles, there are challenges that teachers face all over the world that are very similar. But just one last point, it's the teacher that is at the center of this, and it's the teacher who we should be supporting. I've seen some of the best lessons I've ever seen taught under the mango tree in Uganda, without the classroom, without the technology, but just with that teacher and their passion, their ability to communicate with students, their understanding of the students, their ability to challenge, and also the freedom in which they're behaving in that given moment in time. And I think that's really important, and that's the essence that we should be finding and then placing through our CPD programs to be able to drive and grow this this professional teacher in terms of their behavioural change.
And one last question, Hamish. Where can you buy a pedagogical Satnav? Are they on sale yet?
Well, listen, if you want to speak to Imagine Education, on a serious note, at Imagine, we've been working in a number of countries, and we have pulled together, we've worked alongside UNESCO, alongside UNICEF, the Open University, Microsoft, ministries of education, and over a period of time, we have built behavioural frameworks. And we have a large library of these behavioural frameworks, and then we work with whoever that client might be, whether or not it's going to be in Egypt, where we were working with 1.2 million teachers, or if it was going to be working with the British Council and their master trainers. And we then work with those people to construct their own behavioural library, in essence, their own framework that suits the purpose. These things need to be contextualised, they need to be localised, they need to be fit for purpose within the environment that it's being embedded in. However, the nice thing about that approach is that you know that it is similar to all the other frameworks that are going and being embedded in other countries. So not only are you a fantastic teacher in Kenya, you're also a fantastic teacher in the UK or in the States or in Eastern Europe or wherever that might be. And I think that's something that we should recognise. Teaching is a profession, and it should be respected in that sense.
Thank you very much, Hamish. I'm very aware of time and for people joining us for the 30 minutes. So that's really fantastic insights into the way in which effective professional development should be happening. And I had one message just summing it up, really, saying that teachers, for professional development, is something they do that's not done to them, and that this professional development needs to be applicable, practical to what they're doing in the classroom, and for which they can see the results with their students. So I think that's a fantastic summary, I think, from the person who sent that through. So thank you for that. Thank you again, Hamish. And just a reminder, please do join us on the 28th of April, where we're having Alan Greenberg, who's a venture partner for EDT Partners, and one of the partner companies for Imagine Education, who's going to be talking about distributed learning, the personal learning journey, and personal learning outcomes, and the role of the blockchain digital wallets. So looking forward to that one, a different type of topic that we're going to be addressing, which is great, and it's going to be even more exciting, I think, to do that. And if you have any more questions, then please do contact us at Imagine Education. And once again, thank you very much, Hamish, for an interesting and insightful session. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Hamish.